everybody. This is Professor Joubert Meyer. I'm going to record some lectures for you guys to listen to go with the PowerPoints to try to help you as you go through this study of literature. So first we're going to start with an introduction to literature in general, and then you'll see introductions to the individual parts that we'll be studying this semester. We'll be doing 4 different genres, starting with short stories, then moving into poetry, the long fiction, which is the novel Frankenstein, and then into drama. We'll study 3 short dramas. So, this is a great quote that I found by Italo Calvino from The Uses of Literature, and it really describes what good literature is and or a classic is. And he says a classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say. And we'll see that with a lot of the stories and poems and other such readings that we do, that the reason that we call them classic and that we study them is because they haven't quite finished saying what they started saying, or it still resonates with us in some way. All right, so what is literature? It's not just normal reading. The first use of the word literature was around 1450 CE, and these are a couple of the dictionary definitions based on the Oxford English Dictionary. A familiarity with letters or books, or knowledge acquired from reading or studying books, the action or process of writing a book or literary work, a body of non-fictional books and writings published on a particular subject, or printed matter of any kind, including leaflets, brochures, anything used to advertise products or provide information and advice. But the key thing with literature is that we do a little bit more than just reading what the words on the page are. That will help us get the plot line, but sometimes we have to read a little bit deeper. So, something that we talk about a lot in literature studies is the literary canon, but not a lot of people know what it is. So, this quote from Anne Thompson from the Critics' Debate shows that the words canon and classic both evoke notions of evaluation and hierarchy. The literary canon can be narrowly defined as that which is accepted as authentic, as for example in the context of distinguishing canonical from apocryphal works in relation to the Bible or say to Shakespeare. But it is usually defined more broadly as that which is assumed to be good literature, in fact, the best literature, that which is worth preserving and passing on from one generation to the next. The term classic can sometimes be used to cover a whole canon, such as when we refer to all of Greek and Latin literature as the classics, or it can be a vaguely derogatory term, meaning conventional, such as that is a classic example of revenge tragedy, or a term of high praise applied to a work of literature, which is not only in the canon but at the top of the canonical hierarchy, a great work perceived as having special value for its culture. Now, something with the literary canon is that it is not necessarily something that is always agreed upon. There are some people who agree that something is part of the literary canon. There are other people who decide something should be part of canon because of its value, but others believe, well, because it's popular fiction, it shouldn't be canon. So it's a very subjective idea of what is great literature. So, why do we read literature in general? Some common reasons are to be informed, to be entertained, to be exposed to new ideas, to have familiar concepts reinforced. A lot of this, maybe we read in general, nonfiction stuff might inform us. Not that we don't learn a lot from fiction works, especially fiction can comment on the going ons of the time period it was written in. So it helps us learn the history, and the history of that time period can help us learn the literature. A lot of people read for entertainment, a lot of people read to be exposed to new ideas. And this is especially true because when we see a character, as humans, if you tell us we're doing something wrong, we're more likely to be defensive. But if we see a character doing the same thing doing wrong, and they learn a lesson, we can start to learn how to apply it to our own lives, and we're more receptive to those kinds of lessons. We can also have familiar concepts reinforced, such as lessons like that we've learned as children through fables. Stories help us have those familiar concepts reinforced for us. But for the larger picture, according to Literature Portable Anthology, it does much more than give us a compelling plot or looking into an author's thoughts and emotions, although at its best, it does these things as well. But it's meant to explore the larger world and ways in which people interact with that world and with one another. It shapes us. So every time we read something, we bring our own backgrounds to what we read. So that does help shape what the literature itself based on our perceptions, our different varied backgrounds, giving us different interpretations of the literature, but also reading it shapes us. And when it shapes us, it can shape our world. There are many examples of this throughout history of people reading books. Obviously, in the United States alone, people reading things like Thomas Paine and other, great writers of that time period. Now, that was nonfiction work, but it influenced and created the United States version of democracy and our government and our system of how we function. But not just in nonfiction ideas, in fictional ideas, there are people who have grown up reading things like Harry Potter and Hunger Games, and they're more politically minded today than they used to be in previous generations because they learned you can't trust media or different stories that have taught us different lessons throughout our lives. Some skills that we learn through it are introspection. By learning more about characters and comparing ourselves to certain characters and connecting with them, we learn more about ourselves, but also by what we've learned from the literature itself. Sustained attention is gained because, especially for longer pieces of literature, you have to be able to sustain that attention. You have to be able to get attention enough to it to get, even for a short piece, the deeper down knowledge underneath. It helps us learn deep analysis, which is not just good for analyzing literature or analyzing um, things like movies and other media, but it's also good to have deep analysis skills in general. It helps us, we're studying literature when we write about literature, helps us improve our writing skills, and overall, it helps us improve our knowledge. So, some of the role of good reading. The first key thing when we're reading is we need to slow down. It's tempting to read really fast because we want to know the plot, we want to know what happens next. But if we don't slow down, there's a chance that we're going to miss important plot points. Or, if you don't have the time to read through a story two, three, four times, where you can, use the first time to just get the plot down and then use the second time to analyze and the third time to analyze what you didn't before. It helps to just slow down and kind of contemplate, not necessarily every word, but contemplate what's going on in the story as we read it. If you do have the time, reread the story. Every time I reread something, I get a little bit more out of the story than I did the previous time. The first time I read Midsummer Night's Dream, which is one of the plays that we'll be reading this semester, I was 8. I read the children's version, so it was easier to read because it wasn't Shakespeare's English, but it was also very toned down. So it was really just to kind of get the gist of the play. When I read it again, when I was 12, just to have the chance to read it again, it was okay. Now I'm reading the adult version. What's different? How, getting exposed to Shakespeare's language, how is that different from our current language? When I read it again in high school, it was after learning how to, after learning mythology and getting the mythological references, reading it again in college after learning how to critically analyze, reading it again as a teacher. As I've grown up, not only has the plot changed that I could for me because I could connect with different characters at different time periods, but it also allowed me to learn more about the play, and I always get something new every time I read that play. We want to be critical of what we're reading, not necessarily in a judgment sort of way that, oh, this is good or this is bad, or what they do here is good or bad, but in a way of that we're constantly thinking about what we're reading, we're questioning what we read, so that way we can figure out, well, why did they do it this way? That also helps us become a better writer in studying literature, because if you know what we consider the greats of literature have done in creating great literature, then we can learn from those techniques. There is common myth of hidden meaning, um, in that there's a common joke that sometimes the literature professor will say, well, the curtains were blue to represent the character's depression. And maybe they are, but they might also just be blue. And so it doesn't mean that there's a hidden meaning in every little thing an author does. Sometimes there also could be more than one meaning. Again, because we all bring different backgrounds, different perspectives to our reading, two people may get entirely different things out of the same piece of literature, entirely different perceptions of the story. A great example I have of this, it's not actually with literature, but with film. I watched the film Memento, and to everyone else, it was a surprise twist action thriller film. And without giving away the ending, but the ending was related to something close to me, and it frightened me how close it was and how dangerous that situation would be for me. That Memento was more like a horror film for me compared to everyone else who thought it was just a great thriller and action film. So again, our perspectives can all change the meaning of how we look at something. And part of that role of good reading is the skills you might have learned in previous classes about active reading. So we want to make sure we're annotating, we're taking our notes, maybe using a journal to help us keep track of what's going on and the different things that we notice. And a key thing will be using reference materials. We'll discuss in a little bit about some literary criticism, and sometimes those reference materials, reading what other people have perceived, their interpretations of the literature, can help us understand literature a little bit better. So when we're asking critical questions, there are a few different types of questions that we can ask. First is of the text itself. What genre is it? Does it match the genre that it's supposed to be in? What is the structure? What type of language is used? What style is used? So for example, do they use juxtaposition or a specific word meaning? For example, words have changed in their meaning throughout their history. Um, Words like devoted. Now it doesn't mean, I mean, it means like you're devoted to a cause that, you know, it used to, mean, at least in Austin's time, if you were devoted to someone, yes, that means, head over heels in love with them, devoted to them, potentially engaged to them. But it also had a second meaning of doomed love. So, word meaning, playing with the meaning of words over time, all of this can help change what the text is telling us. We also want to ask critical questions of the author. What was their age when they wrote this? Would that change how they would write the story if they had written it at a different age, a different time period? What was their gender? Does that influence how they're writing? What are their religious beliefs? We'll see in several of the authors we study over the semester that does play a role in what they write. Their family structure. But again, that's not the only clue. It's not just, oh, the author had a bad childhood, so they write it into a story. That's not always the case. We also want to look at cultural context. What is society like during that particular time period? What was going on in the history? If we read a story like Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five that talks a lot about World War II and the Cold War and all this stuff that happened. It's a much different situation, a much different book if we don't understand that a war was going on either right before or right during or right after he wrote the book. Or, well, obviously not after he wrote the book, but that he wrote the book either during the war or right after the war. Of the reader, we want to ask questions. Who is the intended audience for this particular story? Why is something written a certain way? This can also change how we connect with a story. So there are a lot of stories that people say, well, it's just too hard to get into. For example, Judy Blume books are written mostly for young women and girls, that it's a lot easier for them to connect with the issues in the stories than it is for young men to connect with. Same thing, The Catcher in the Rye is a story that, although it has a lot to do with mental illness and losing a friend, it has a lot of male related, because J.D. Salinger was a male author, male related emotions and connections that men find it easier to get into Catcher in the Rye than women do. So it, depending on who the audience is, that could change how something is written and why certain people get into it better than others. Now, talking about literary criticism and theory is the fact that not all literary criticism is infallible. It is meant to be the reasoned consideration of literary works and issues, applies as a term to any argumentation about literature, whether or not specific works are analyzed, and the functions vary widely, ranging from the reviewing of books as they are published to systematic theoretical discussion. So there are some that just review how a book was done and what it was like, and uh, what's good about it, what's not. Some of them will actually have discussions about, what does this mean? What does this character represent? And try to help us get a deeper understanding of the book. Reviews may sometimes determine whether a given book will be widely sold, but many works succeed commercially despite negative reviews, and many classic works, including even Melville's Moby Dick that was published in 1851, have acquired appreciation long after being unfavorably reviewed and at first neglected. When Herman Melville first wrote Moby Dick, he thought he was a failure because nobody liked his book. As said here, it was badly reviewed. And that's because, for the time period, having a book of, hey, maybe we shouldn't kill all the whales, we now consider him progressive and ahead of his time, because at the time period it was, wow, why would we stop killing whales? We still need the stuff from them, the materials that we get from hunting whales. So it wasn't popular, and he died thinking that it was a failure. Now we consider him one of the classics that you read in school. One of criticism's principal functions is to express the shifts in sensibility that make such reevaluations possible. So again, even there are some that literary critics would say, well, it's just popular literature. It's good, but it's just popular literature. And then later it gets added to the canon. So it just depends on how things are reviewed. And again, a person who's reviewing it and making critical assumptions about it, if they're the only conversation about it, then that's all we're going to think about is what that one person said about it. However, if a lot of people study literature and a lot of different perspectives come around, then someone might appreciate something that someone else didn't, and it makes the story more popular, makes the story more paid attention to, just because someone was able to see something that the original critic wasn't able to do. So that also leads to why it's so relevant today, because even though all the books have been read and written about, not, well, at least the classics, there are many books still today that haven't been written about in from a critical point of view. There are many that have been written about from a critical point of view, but not from the same perspective. So everybody still has a chance to bring a new perspective to a story. So these are just some examples of theories that we apply when we're looking at literature that help us maybe understand a little bit more about literature. Formalism and new criticism, feminist and gender criticism. So figuring out, is a novel or a story that we're looking at potentially giving a feminist message or some kind of criticism on gender roles. Queer theory focuses a lot on the LGBTQ, and is there any underlying messages from if we were to apply queer theory? Marxist criticism, cultural studies, post-colonial criticism. We have had a lot of colonialism in our world, and then after colonialism, how is literature changing? Historical criticism versus new historicism, psychological theories. This one, excuse me, is a lot of fun because if you apply psychology to a character, think, well, they're just a fictional character. How could I do that? But maybe they're showing symptoms of a disease that you studied about in psychology. That could change how we think about that character if we know their motivations, if we know what might be wrong with them or right with them compared to another character, to understand them a little better, to understand why they do what they do in a story. Reader response theories, structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, breaking literature down into its most basic parts. These are all different theories you can, if you go further in the study of literature, you'll learn a little bit more about these different theories and how to apply them to stories. But they're just different frameworks that allow us to see literature a little bit different. So I hope that helps with the intro to literature. I'll have some more videos up in a little bit that will help with some of the other material that we'll be learning about for short stories, as well as kind of an overview of our class as well. Thanks and have a great day.